So I have some remarks I'll say, introduce you, you'll speak, and people have index cards on the table that they write questions on. And then they'll bring questions up here, I'll read the question. You do, yes you do, yeah. You are going to speak with me? No, because he's recording you. I want you to stay here if at all possible. I know it'll be hard. Okay, we're going to get started. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation by Howard Kerr, former Naval Aide and Commander of U.S. Naval Forces in Vietnam, former military aide to Vice Presidents Agnew and Ford, Naval Aide and Deputy Presidential Advisor to President Ford, and President and CEO of 3 companies, and, probably most important, he's a member of the University of Iowa's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean's Advisory Board. He's going to be speaking to us today on Vietnam, 1968 to 69, New Leadership, Same Stalemate. I'm Dave Martin, President of ICFRC and host for today's program. ICFRC hosts community programs to address topics of international interest. We thank our members, volunteers, and interns for making these forums possible since, wait for it, Return of the Jedi was the #1 movie in America, 1983. I want to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs and the University of Iowa's honors program. They contribute vital time, talent, and logistics to our organization. I also thank the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support, and I thank today's special financial sponsors, the University of Iowa Community Credit Union, Bill and Pat Supel. I also thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2 and the UI Library's digital archives. Please be sure to like City Channel 4 on Facebook. Our format today is our usual one. Following our speaker's presentation at about 1 p.m., we will have a 15-minute Q&A from written questions submitted by audience members. You can write your questions on the cards that should be at your table. The cards will be collected by our interns at the conclusion of our speaker's remarks. And please silence your cell phones and electronic devices. I will also ask that if you must leave early, please do so quietly and without disturbing others. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Howard Kerr. Following his graduation from the University of Iowa, Howard received his MA in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He served as military aide to Vice Presidents Agnew and Ford, Naval Aide and Deputy Presidential Counselor to President Gerald Ford, and he served as military fellow on the Council of Foreign Relations. Upon retiring from the military, Howard was president and CEO of Custom Technologies, Graybill Aerospace Industries Limited, and Pocklington Financial Corporation. He's also served as the mayor of Lake Forest, Illinois. And as I mentioned earlier, he's a member of the University of Iowa's Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean's Advisory Board. Please welcome Howard Kerr.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dave, for the introduction. And I've had the opportunity to travel internationally to numerous countries, and I never left a country where I didn't learn something about not just that country, but about our own country. How other people see us, how other people understand us or misunderstand us. And when I look at the mosaic today, in many respects, we need more understanding than anything that I can recall. We have some very, very difficult issues ahead of us in the next few years but in 1954, I came to this city and this campus. And while I was registering for classes, the French were leaving South Vietnam in 1954, after almost a century of colonialism. And it was a part of what was known as French Indochina, which included Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam. I am not a scholar, I'm not an academic, so what I'm going to talk about today is what I know personally, what I have observed, what I've participated in, and so if you have any scholarly questions, please do not put them down on your paper and send them forward to me. All right. When I left the University of Iowa, first time in my life I was ever number one at anything. And I was the number one draft choice in Polk County. And I ended up as an officer in the United States Navy. That was not something that I had ever planned for or even understood. I'd never even been a Boy Scout, I don't think. And but I always had a great interest in international affairs, international relations, and soon I realized that the Navy offered a platform where I could continue my interest, and it turned out that was a good decision for me. The Vietnam and our participation and involvement there covered 6 presidential administrations, starting with Harry Truman. We had a military assistance and advisory group in Vietnam that was supporting the French effort. When the French left in '84, the United States increased the size of that and became advisors to the South Vietnam military. So we had an interest from Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Gerald Ford. So when you look at the history of our involvement, that's a considerable period of time and a considerable period of interest. Vietnam is about 8,000 miles from the west coast of the United States. Over those years, we went from a small group of military advisors to over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. 500,000. Compare that to today's involvement we have in the Middle East with maybe 10, 15,000 at the most. We had 500,000 young people, as well as professionals, that were sent to Vietnam. We also involved the infrastructure from California, all of our bases there, to Hawaii, to Guam, to Japan, to Korea. When you consider the involvement, it took an enormous amount of effort to maintain 500,000 troops every day in Vietnam. I'm just trying to put a mosaic together here of what that involvement was. It was enormous. It was huge. It also included our 7th Fleet with 3 carrier task groups. And we also had the CIA, our State Department, our AID people. The involvement that we had in Vietnam was just extraordinary. was living, or my wife and I, we were finishing up my graduate school in Boston in 1968. I had been there for 2 years, and I had done a master's paper on the role of the United States military in Vietnam from 1954 to 1964 that got the attention of a Navy admiral by the name of Elmo Zumwalt, who had just been assigned by President Nixon to be the new commander in Vietnam. I had a phone call from him one evening, and he told me that he wanted me to join him. And I remember thinking it over, and this was on a Thursday evening, I remember, and I said, well, when would you like me to join you? And he said, Monday morning in San Diego. And I looked at my wife, and we were wondering. I met him on Monday morning, on time, in San Diego, and started a marvelous relationship with him. And he was a real cerebral military person. And we went to a number of meetings and conferences and things to prepare him for assuming his duties in Vietnam. And I was able to be with him at all of these things. And so it was a great education for me to understand our involvement, which was enormous in terms of the logistics, which I've tried to point out, as well as the number of people we had involved. Vietnam, probably in the late 50s, became the most talked about and most strategic piece of real estate in geopolitics. We were let me just say this, that the only way I can really, and I'm going to say this now, understand, Vietnam, the only way I have ever been able to rationalize our involvement and what happened is when you put it in the context of the Cold War. And of course, the Cold War was at its height in the end of the Eisenhower administration, and Vietnam became a piece of that Cold War that grew and grew in importance, to the point where it was very hard to continue to understand what that importance really was. In 19 we finished all of those things. We went to jungle school, and then we arrived in Vietnam. And on the way over, the Admiral and I had begun to discuss Vietnam, its history, what it meant to the United States, our involvement. And he turned to me on the flight from Manila to Ho Chi Minh, now Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, and he said that it was very important for us to understand what was happening in the United States if we were going to understand what our role was going to be in Vietnam. Now let's go back just for a moment through 1968, because I think the context is extremely important. One of the first things that happened in 1968 was the New Hampshire primary. That Gene McCarthy of Minnesota challenged the sitting president. The sitting president won that primary, but it demonstrated that he did not have the kind of support going forward in that, and he soon withdrew. President President Johnson withdrew. The next thing that became happened was the Tet Offensive. In 1967, General Westmoreland, who was the commander in Vietnam, had come to the United States, addressed the Congress of the United States, gave them an extremely positive view of what was happening in Vietnam, and suggested that we would start bringing troops home. The Tet Offensive, which was caught on television, all of a sudden the war was no longer in the jungles, it was in the cities of Vietnam. Our embassy was surrounded by Viet Cong, and most of the cities of Vietnam were under attack as a part of this overall offensive. And while from a military point of view, it was a disaster for the North Vietnamese, from a political point of view, it was an absolute disaster for the United States. All of a sudden, people were watching television and wondering, how can this be? How can our embassies be under attack? How can we be losing this war? And most of you probably remember Walter Cronkite. He was the voice of the evening news. He had been to Vietnam, and he began to turn this public opinion around. It had been moving in that direction, but Tet accelerated the views in the United States about how this war was going. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy, brother to John Kennedy, who had been assassinated, was assassinated in Los Angeles the evening that he had won the California primary. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, we had uprisings in some of our major cities. I can still remember the pictures of the smoke over Baltimore, in fact, 50 years ago today, Martin Luther King gave a speech on Vietnam, which carried an awful lot of weight with a lot of people in the United States. I read it again this morning. I didn't agree with it then, and I still don't agree with it, but it was a very, very powerful, powerful speech. The Democrats had their convention to nominate their presidential candidate in Chicago. Mayor Daley had to bring the National Guard into Chicago to quell what was happening on Michigan Avenue and in Grant Park across the street. And surrounding all of this, all these events, we had the Civil Rights Movement, the feminist movement. I mean, 1968 was quite a year. And we ended it all up by electing Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, President and Vice President of the United States. He campaigned by saying that he would go to Vietnam. He had a plan to bring home, or to settle the war, bring home the Americans. At that time, 500 and some thousand. Now, going back to my arriving with Admiral Zumwalt into Vietnam, he showed me a letter that he had received, a personal letter from the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Paul Nitze. Paul Nitze had been a person of renown throughout Washington foreign policy circles. And he and Admiral Zumwalt had been an aide of his when he was the Secretary of the Navy. This letter was in his own handwriting. And the Admiral went by the nickname Bud, and he said, "Bud, when you get to Vietnam, work to turn all of the American assets over to the Vietnamese as fast as you can, because we have to get out of that country." Now, this was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. In a private letter, that was not his official position, but in a private letter to Admiral Zumwalt. And I remember turning to the Admiral and I said, I'm very perplexed. I said, here we are heading into a war zone. You are a wartime commander, and what we're talking about is how we're going to get out. And I soon realized that there was a new, quote, strategy. So on this introduction to me, when I talk about new strategy, same results, we arrived in Saigon, and the Admiral and I went on a 10-day tour of Vietnam. Went everywhere from Phu Quoc in the south to the DMZ in the north, and everything in between. And it was quite interesting. And then he turned to me and he said, "Howard," he said, "I want you to take the next 7 or 10 days, and I want you now to go out and talk to the lieutenants." Because he'd heard from all the generals. He had heard from all of the senior people. And and he knew that I could get, because of my rank, and I could get close to the people who were really doing the fighting. So I spent 7 days or 10 days, I can't remember now, touring around Vietnam, trying to make sense from the people who had been there, who were on the ground, who were exposed every single day because they were in a war zone. What was that doing to them? But mostly, what was the sense that there was no direction? This was what I began to sense from the people. They were not wanting to leave. They were not ready to say we cannot win this. But they were looking for leadership, and they were looking for direction. Well, about 2 weeks after we got to Vietnam, General Abrams called a meeting of all of his senior people. He had, Admiral Zumwalt was a 3-star admiral. He had a 3-star general that was in charge of the Air Force. He had a 3-star Marine, and his deputy was a 4-star, and General Abrams. So there were a lot of stars in this room that day. And not only did General Abrams have the responsibility for the war and the direction of it, he had the responsibility to train the Vietnamese, because technically that's what we were there for. We were there to train and equip the Vietnamese to fight that war. So he had a meeting regularly just to discuss where does that stand? Because we had millions and millions of dollars of equipment, aircraft, small boats, artillery pieces in country to train the Vietnamese to fight the North Vietnamese, the Viet Minh. And the general wanted to know, where did that stand? So we got to Tan Son Nhut at his base there, and his deputy said the general would be right in. He had just flown back from Washington. And General Abrams, who had been General Patton's favorite junior officer during the Second World War, he took on all of the, he reminded me of the movie Patton the minute he walked into the room, big cigar in his mouth, and really a person of that immediately gets your attention. And he sat down, and the first one of the services to give their presentation was the Air Force. And this good-looking, well-dressed Air Force colonel stood up, and he started, and he talked about, well, maybe by 1971 or early 72 we could do this and we could do that. And now this is 1968. And I was sitting about where that gentleman is there, and all of a sudden I spotted General Abrams, and he raised his fist and he hit the table. And the ashtray that had his cigar went over and smashed down on the table. And he took a breath and he said, "Bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. That's all I ever get out of the goddamn Air Force is bullshit." Well, that got everybody's attention. And he patted his chest and he said, "I just got back from the White House." He said, "I have a letter from the Commander-in-Chief to me telling me what my orders are in Vietnam." Now, he had been brought back because there was a political campaign going on for president, and they wanted to have a bombing halt in North Vietnam so as to assist Humphrey, who was the Democratic candidate. At least they thought that would be an important thing if that happened. Plus, that was to lead the negotiations with the North Vietnamese. That was, and President Johnson wanted to leave office with that. And General Abrams looked at everybody and he says, "Is there anybody in this room, anybody, that has any understanding of what's going on in the United States?" The President of the United States cannot be seen on the streets of Washington. Our schools, our universities are at war with their students. We had people burning their draft cards and going to Canada and Mexico. We had a young man burn himself to death in front of the Pentagon. Does anybody understand what's happening in the United States? And you're telling me that we're going to be here training these Vietnamese until 1971? And he got up and he walked out of the room. And Admiral Zumwalt called me over and he said, "Howard," he said, "all that work we did last night to prepare for this," he said, "we're going to pump it up a little bit," because the Admiral had put together what he called an accelerated effort to get out of Vietnam. So anyway, General Abrams came back in, listened to what all the people had to say, and next thing was that the election happened, and the next thing, the day after the election, we had a message from the new National Security Advisor to the President, Henry Kissinger, with 50 questions to be answered about what was happening in Vietnam. Just on a personal note, the last year I was in Boston, I was able to take a course under Henry Kissinger's National Security Policy course for 1 year, And of course, he was just another professor at Harvard. Now he was the national security advisor to the president, and he wanted the answers to 50 questions. Well, we worked very hard trying to answer that. But the fact is that what had happened in the United States, what was happening in the United States, was having enormous impact on everyone in Vietnam. We knew that in a sense, we were either going to have a negotiated settlement or we were going to withdraw. Those were the two options. And the strategy that was put together, as I said, was that to go on the offensive, and that's exactly what President Nixon did, to go on the offensive, to try to hurt the Vietnamese as bad as they could, to bring them to the negotiating table. We had no idea of the resilience of these people. It didn't work. It didn't work at all. In fact, the Joint Chiefs had recommended that policy back in 1965 to President Johnson, and he threw them all out of the White House. He was listening to Robert McNamara and other people who believed that in the Cold War we needed not to strike the enemy with all of our military might, but we needed graduated escalation. And what we needed to do was to demonstrate to them that with each escalation, they will understand. They will understand that we're here for real. We're not going to leave, and at some point, they will capitulate and come to the table. It didn't happen that way. The North Vietnamese lost something like 1.2 million fighters. I remember we were trying to calculate one time how many actual people had we killed that were uniformed, in battle. And when we finished, it was 1.5 times the population of North Vietnam. The way we were beginning to measure the war was through body counts and head counts, and who was. These are just terrible things to try to understand what was happening. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh looked across the South China Sea to the Philippines and saw that the United States, at the end of the war, had said, we are returning the Philippines to self-rule. We had been ruling them since the Spanish-American War. And Ho Chi Minh declared, using the Thomas Jefferson's, he almost quoted him stating that, the United States has done doing this for the Philippines. They will understand that we want to be a free country. We do not want the French coming back, and we certainly don't. We want to unite our country. And that was their goal. And they were willing to make enormous sacrifices to achieve that. Of course, they had a lot of support from China and also the Soviet Union, because they didn't have the base to put together the kind of military forces that they had. But once again, I close here with stating that I have, over a period of 14 years, I was in Vietnam, or in the waters off Vietnam, 4 times. I spent 1 year there from 1968 to 1969. And once again, I when I talk to the students about Vietnam like I'm talking today, I tell them that the only way I can understand what happened is to put it in the context of the Cold War. We are not a country that can send that many people, 500,000. And every day in every village and city and town in Iowa, young men were being drafted. I was in the White House in 1975 when the Congress pulled the plug on Vietnam. That's how we finally got out of there. Not through negotiations, not through they pulled the funding. And we left. And you have seen the pictures of the ignominious way in which we left. We got caught up in a cycle that made sense with regards to the Cold War. That's a whole different lecture, but it's it's something that we have to keep in mind. We're engaged today, not nearly to the extent that we were then, but so I think it's very important for us all to understand that we really need to understand when we put people in harm's way. We need to understand, and we have to have a clear-cut strategy, and people understand exactly what we're doing. And we understand the people that we're up against. And that's calling for an awful lot. That's why organizations like this for you, what people like you across the country who come to these meetings and listen to people and bring your thoughts and your ideas. And I've been working a little bit with the international programs over at the university. And as I said when I started, I've had the opportunity to visit many, many countries. And I've never left one without learning something important about those people and bringing away from it something that was important to us, what they thought of us. And so Vietnam was tore apart the country, I believe. Trying to look back to the 67, 68, 69 time frame. I was in Washington part of that time, in Vietnam, of course, in part of that time, and there wasn't anything since our Civil War of the 1860s that it had the impact on this country that Vietnam had. Thanks very much.
If you have questions, please write them on the card. Some of you are holding up your hands, and some of our interns will be around to collect them. I want to remind you of our next two programs. On Thursday, April 13th, Jerry Anthony, Associate Professor, UI Department of Urban and Regional Planning, and Uday Kumar, Professor of Mechanical Engineering, will present Women's Health and the Environment, Going Up in Smoke. And on Thursday, April 20th, James Woody Watson, who's a Professor Emeritus from Harvard University, will present Culinary Nationalism, Fighting with Food. Okay. Questions? I've got some. So I'll start off with this one. Do you see signs that mistakes of the Cold War will be repeated?
Well, that's not my field. I was here to talk about Vietnam, but I'll be happy to give you a personal opinion. It's not a scholarly one. I think that people have said those who forget history repeat it. So I hope that that the answer to that is that we are much wiser. I think there's at least four enormously important issues that are going to come to a head sooner than later. One is North Korea. The minute that they demonstrate they have the capacity to attack our troops in the Far East or hit the United States, something will have to happen. I don't know what that is, but I don't think anybody will be able to live with that. I think that Russia has enormous internal problems, but they also have the largest number of nuclear weapons and the ability to deliver them of any country besides us. As we sit here today, Russia has at sea nuclear submarines, ballistic submarines that can blow up the United States. We have them also. We're still involved in the Cold War, in a sense. I think that China is such an important country, so large, so we have to find ways to work together. They have, I think, taken aggressive action in the South China Sea, and those are international waters. 80% of the world's goods flow through that area. Pretty soon, the Indian Ocean will be far more important than the Atlantic or Pacific. And those choke points are extraordinarily important militarily, but all that supports Japan, the Philippines, Korea, Vietnam, all of those countries are being challenged by these efforts to turn the South China Sea into China territory. And of course, I think we have the Middle East, particularly Iran, where it's going to be another situation where we're going to be dealing with real problems. I think that we certainly were able to deal with the Cold War. We came very close, particularly in the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was as close as we've ever come to a nuclear war in the post-war period. And so I hope and pray and trust that we have very wise people who are looking at these issues very, very closely, because that's just my personal opinion. But I think all of these are going to come to some sort of a head in the near future.
Okay, this question asks, why didn't the U.S. leave Vietnam when the French did? Was there anyone advocating for it at the time, I guess?
No, there wasn't, and we didn't really have anybody to exit with the French. We had a few people at the Military Assistance Advisory Group. And we never really had a real escalation in Vietnam until John Kennedy's administration. We were adding a few people, but the the North Vietnamese had remained north of the DMZ, and then about 63 or so, they began to trickle down into South Vietnam and were threatening South Vietnam militarily. And that was the first major escalation on our part. We sent 16 to 18,000 advisors to Vietnam. And that was the beginning. And we created what they called a MAC-V, which was headed up by a four-star general. Up until that time, there was a Navy captain that was in Saigon that was handling all this, and all of a sudden, when you put a command structure together with a four-star general in charge, you know that the administration has decided. And the decision is that we could not lose Vietnam. We absolutely could not lose Vietnam. That goes into a lot of theory about the Cold War, and and what would happen if we did what the person that asked this question, basically, we don't want anything to do with Vietnam. Well, as I said, from the administration point of view, particularly in Eisenhower and Kennedy, that is the most significant strategic piece of real estate in the world with regards to the Cold War.
Did candidate Richard Nixon sabotage the peace negotiations with North Vietnam?
No, I don't believe so. I think there's a new book out that suggests that. And I read a review of that book, and that was a very close election, as you may recall. Richard Nixon was elected with 43% of the vote. There was a third-party candidate that I'm reaching for his name, but I can't right now. But when Johnson called General Abrams home, and I was giving you that scenario, the sense was that by talking about or suggesting a bombing halt that would be followed by negotiations, that would help Senator Humphrey. And in fact, they sent Nixon supposedly sent a lady by the name of Anne Chenault to Saigon to lobby for the President Thieu not to agree with this bombing halt. So there was a lot going on, as there was in most of our elections, but I don't think that from what I've read and what I understand, my own personal opinion is that Nixon did not. He may have attempted, but he did not.
This question asks to please describe the jungle school that you mentioned and what was its purpose.
The jungle
School?
Oh, well, the jungle school was required for anybody going in country, because if you got captured, they wanted you to understand what could happen. And I spent with the Admiral, it was 3 days in the jungle in the Philippines, and we got captured, and we understood what could happen. That's what it was about.
Okay. I'll make this the last one. This asks, what advice would you give to a cadet on his or her journey on commissioning as an officer?
Oh, well, listen, I have had the opportunity in my lifetime to be an officer in the United States Navy. I've been the captain or the CEO of a couple corporations, and I was dabbled in local politics. I have never worked with any organization, and I mean this, that is as proud, as capable, that has the character of the United States military. it's really hard to describe. I was fortunate to work with some very, very senior people at an early age, which helped me a great deal to understand the bigger picture, rather than what scrubbing doing the decks on board the ships, and but I can't tell you how much everything that I did when I left the Navy, and whatever I accomplished, it was because of what I was able to learn in the United States military. It's a remarkable. In fact, I just finished reading a book last night on General Douglas MacArthur. I've read 5 books about him, and this one focused on his decisions in the Pacific, the war. And he was a very complicated person, and half of the people wanted to shoot him, and the other half wanted to give him another medal. But when he talked about duty, honor, country, he believed everything he said. So I would encourage anybody. In fact, I think myself, we should have something in this country for young people to have the option, not to make a commitment for life, but to take be able to do something. The military might be one of those. It's the only organization I've ever worked for where every single person I ever met wanted you to succeed. They want everyone to succeed. And, that tends to not have as much meaning the higher you get up as the politics begin to play. But I can't tell you how many young people that came to work on ships that I commanded, and they learned all about life. They learned about themselves, and some of them stayed and some of them left. When they left, they took tools with them that they use for the rest of their life. I still hear from some of these people. And so I salute all of the people in uniform. I salute what those organizations stand for. And I would encourage any young man, woman, to engage themselves and to try to learn. There's a long history, and anyway, as you can see, I'm very proud of having been in the military.
Let's give everybody thanks, Howard. Once again, I want to thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa's International Programs, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, for their generous support, and today's special financial sponsors, Mason K. Braverman, whoops, that's not, is that what I said? No, sorry. University of Iowa Community Credit Union, and Bill and Pat Supel. Wrong. I don't know. My fault. And Howard, as a token of our appreciation, we would like to present you with our coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again. We are adjourned.